Good afternoon and a belated welcome to week 5 of Change Leadership. This week is really the final week of course content before you next week work on and deliver your team project, and the following week write your own paper about your own development as a change leader. I want to point to just a couple of things about this week, also reflecting back on last week, particularly some of the things that came up in the quizzes as I graded them. There are a few points that I want to emphasize, but let's start with this week on finding leverage. It does you absolutely no good other than perhaps your own intellectual satisfaction to understand the issues facing an organization, examine the drivers of change, use the pyramid model to get from what we see on the surface down to what's underlying the ongoing patterns in an organization. If we're not able to see how we might be able to move out of those patterns and break through the structure that's allowing those patterns to perpetuate. So that's what you're looking at this week. You're using the Meadows article, you're using the Holiday article, and also the work that Sengi has done on change leadership and understanding the necessity of standing in the tension between the current reality or the status quo and the future, and able to move forward. The Andersons give you the change leader accountability model, which is another way, a place to locate where that leverage exists and where you can begin to apply it for the greatest organizational results. Um, that's what you're working on in week 5. Let me back up a little bit to what we've talked about before and what we discussed in the quiz last week. One thing that I pointed out in the quiz had to do with where you began to see the micro level change begin to occur. And I pushed some of you back to as far back as we could begin to see change taking place, micro level change at the intersection of relationships among people, but also as those relationships impacted the culture and the organization, first being when Skip missed the basket when he was throwing the basketball. That pointed to an organizational issue, that things were not all well in Pleasantville. They had always all made the baskets, and the basket that Skip shot was missed. Why did that happen? Because Bud had upset his universe by telling him that perhaps this wasn't a good time to ask Mary Sue out on a date. And then that moved on to the date itself, where Skip and Mary Sue go to Lover's Lane. Skip sees the rose on the way home, the first time we see color. Something is changing. And then we see Skip talking to his fellow basketball players where they all miss the basket. And then later on we see Mary Sue telling her mom about Lover's Lane. And her mom does her thing in the bathtub. The tree catches fire. All kinds of things transpire in Betty's life. But also Bud becomes unknowingly or unintentionally the one who has brought the outside world into Pleasantville by understanding and teaching people how to put out a fire, which then leads to his reading of Huckleberry Finn that opens up the library, etc., etc., etc. The point being, in your analysis, in your project next week, as you're looking at the particular issue that has made the news in your organization, and you are tracing pattern on the iceberg diagram, the clearest pattern or patterns are going to emerge when you go back as far as you can to the beginning of that pattern. That means you're going to need to do some research, right, beyond the one particular event, to see what else has been going on in the organization that could have led to the occurrence of the event that you are beginning with. And I mean, going backwards in time. So what was going on last week, last month, 6 months ago, a year ago? Maybe not only what was going on in the organization, but what was going on in the industry when it comes to the Houston Astros and cheating. Are they really the first ones to cheat? Are they the first ones to get caught? Go backwards in time, and as I just mentioned, go vertically across space within the organization, outside the organization. How did those patterns develop? What supported those patterns? Why have they stayed in place? And this is where, when you have enough data on patterns, you can begin to see which archetypes are most important. In your project, I would not go more than 3, as I asked you to do in Pleasantville, although there were more, simply because more than 3 is just going to be too much for you to manage in your project. But gather enough data across time, backwards in time, and also across space, across divisions within the organization, maybe within the industry. Discover those patterns. And as I said before, as you look at patterns, they don't do any good if you can't find a way to leverage out of them. That's where this week's material comes in handy. Last week, in the Pleasantville analysis, I asked you at which scene was Pleasantville broken out of all of its patterns and completely transformed. Some of you got it. Many of you pointed to other scenes that were important but weren't the final breakthrough. It's not where the leverage was applied to the right spot to actually break Pleasantville free of all of those archetypes, all of those patterns that were holding it hostage. And that was when Bud had finally figured things out, and he got the mayor upset. The mayor became unpleasant, as Bud had when he broke through his particular paradigm, and not wanting to believe that he was no longer pleasant, he ran out of the courtroom. Now, there's a side lesson here, too, and that is, as you are looking for leverage, don't forget the importance of the internal drivers. Leadership mindset, leadership behavior is critical. And the ability of Bud to have figured that out, and for the leader in Pleasantville to step aside, is then what led to its full transformation. So how do you work with leadership in your organization, moving them into a place where they can risk not being in control, not being in charge, and allowing the paradigm shifters to do their work? And this is another point about leadership. When you get to writing your leadership paper, and as you're looking at leadership in your projects next week, remember that leadership in an organization is not likely to be the paradigm shifter. Remember, the paradigm shifters exist on the edge of your current paradigm. They're not in the middle of it. They're not at the top of it. Paradigm shifters, as we saw with the 2 lead characters in Pleasantville, usually come from the outside, or they exist on the very edge of your paradigm. They don't have much to lose. They only benefit by changing the paradigm, not by maintaining the status quo. And so as you're looking for the paradigm shifters, they're the people that the leaders can learn from, if the leaders will learn from the paradigm shifters, if the leaders aren't fearful of following the shifters. In that way, the role of the leader becomes pioneer. Which efforts are we going to pioneer and support? So be careful in those definitions of shifter and pioneer as you do your project next week and as you write your final paper. There was also some confusion, and this is important this week, in some of the quizzes. You talked about shared vision as really being a decision to not disrupt the status quo or to maintain the current reality. I just want to make sure that you are fully understanding what shared vision is. It is not a maintenance of the status quo. The leadership within Pleasantville, they did not have vision. They did not have shared vision. The shared vision is when members of Pleasantville began to understand that something new was afoot and that they could gain from experimenting with it and see something new unfold. A new passion, a new excitement, a new resolve came forward simply because together they began to see a new world of possibilities. And of course, that's closely connected to team learning, where together they experimented and learned about those possibilities. So pay attention to that and don't forget the centrality of complex adaptive systems and finding out where all of this began to, from micro level change in those relationships, also understanding that there's no guarantee. The future is not predictable. Insights on the film, unwanted pregnancies in the future, maybe, maybe, if it was real. No discussion on birth control. Venereal disease, perhaps. All kinds of new possibilities arrived with the new Pleasantville, but also new problems. Remember that today's problems were yesterday's solutions. So once you break through into a new paradigm, there are going to be new issues that come up that need to be resolved that will eventually move you to yet another paradigm. I think that's all that I have to say for this week. I know I've gone on a bit long, but I don't have the chance to do lecture. Please, if anything I've said needs more clarification, or if you didn't understand, please let me know. I'm glad to talk with you as a team or as individuals, and I hope you have a great week, and I'm looking forward to see what rolls out over the next couple of weeks.